My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Not from anger, though. There was plenty of that. They were trembling because I had just watched my son look at the floor while his wife told him to be quiet. In front of me, in my own kitchen, and her mother sat there at my table, sipping my coffee, and smiled like she had won something. That was the moment I understood. Not just what was happening, but how long it had already been happening. Let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with that dinner. It starts the way most quiet disasters do, with something small that you almost don't notice. My son is 36 years old. He has his mother's eyes warm, a little too trusting in my stubbornness, which I'll admit has not always served either of us well. I raised him alone after my wife passed. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. My son was 22, just starting his career as a civil engineer, and I watched him grieve in that contained, careful way that broke my heart more than any crying would have. He didn't fall apart. He folded everything inward and kept moving. I always worried about that, about what it would mean when he finally let someone in. He met his wife at a work conference in Atlanta. He called me that same night, which he almost never did, and I could hear something different in his voice. Not just excitement, something softer than that. He said, "Dad, I met someone, and I don't know how to explain it, but I think she's the one." I laughed. I told him not to say that after one conversation. He said, I know, but Dad." Looking back, I should have paid closer attention to why that particular quality moved him so much. Her name was Vanessa. She was 32, worked in marketing, and she was, I will say this honestly, extraordinarily charming when she wanted to be. When I met her the first time, at a restaurant in Charlotte where my son lived, she asked me questions about my 30 years as a structural engineer. Real questions. She remembered details from one sentence and referenced them 10 minutes later. She laughed at the right moments. When she excused herself from the table, my son leaned over and whispered, "Well?" And I said, "She's impressive. I meant it." I also felt something I couldn't name, something faint and uncomfortable, like a draft from a window you can't find. Vanessa's mother visited for the engagement party. Her name was Diane, 60 years old, recently divorced, and she had the same quality as her daughter, that focused, attentive warmth that made you feel seen. She hugged me and said she was so glad her daughter had found a family like ours. I thanked her. I poured her a drink. I told myself the discomfort I felt was just protectiveness. Every father feels it. You hand your child's heart to a stranger and you just have to trust. The wedding was beautiful. My son cried during the vows, which I was not expecting, and I had to look up at the ceiling for a full minute. Vanessa's mother sat in the front row and dabbed her eyes. My son's friends gave a toast that made the whole room laugh. I danced with my daughter-in-law, and she put her head on my shoulder for a moment near the end of the song, and she said, "Thank you for raising him." I believed she meant it. The first thing I noticed, about 4 months after the wedding, was that my son started canceling plans. Nothing dramatic. A fishing trip we'd had on the calendar since January, he called 3 days before to say Vanessa had a work event and she needed him there. A birthday dinner for my old colleague. He said they had tickets to something he'd forgotten. Thanksgiving that year, he arrived 4 hours late. Vanessa had needed to stop and see her mother on the way. Her mother, who lived 20 minutes from their house in the opposite direction from mine. I didn't say anything. You don't, at first. You tell yourself people are busy. Marriage is an adjustment. He has his own life now, and that is exactly how it should be. But then I noticed something else. When my son called me, and the calls were getting shorter, further apart, he spoke differently. Not the words exactly. The pacing. He used to ramble when he talked to me, jumping from topic to topic, interrupting himself with tangents. That was how I knew he was relaxed. Now his answers were careful, measured. He said we in places where the decision clearly had nothing to do with his wife. We decided I should cut back on overtime. We think it's better if I don't take the hunting trip this year. We feel like maybe I should scale back the retirement contributions for now. That last one stopped me cold. I'm not a financial expert, but I spent 30 years managing project budgets in the tens of millions. I know what scale back retirement contributions means at 36 years old. I asked him, as gently as I could, why? He said they had some expenses. I asked what kind. He said he'd rather not get into it. I said, "Son, your mother and I started your college fund the week we brought you home from the hospital. You can talk to me about money." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, Vanessa handles our finances now." It just made sense. She's better at it than I am. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the following months, I watched my son, the man I had raised to be confident and deliberate, become someone who second-guessed every sentence. He stopped mentioning his own projects at work unless I specifically asked. He stopped telling the long, winding stories he used to love. When Vanessa was in the room, his eyes would go to her before he answered almost any question. Not lovingly, carefully, like he was checking something. I told myself I was imagining it. I was a retired man with too much time and not enough to focus it on. I was projecting. I was one of those fathers-in-law who couldn't let go. I tried very hard to believe that. Then, 11 months ago, my son called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He never called on Tuesday afternoons. He was at work when he called. I could hear the particular echo of the parking garage he used. He said, "Dad, I just wanted to hear your voice." I said, "Is everything okay?" He said, Yeah, everything's fine." His voice had that folded inward quality again. The same one from when his mother died. I said, "Michael, talk to me." He said, "I can't right now." And he hung up. I drove to Charlotte the next morning. I didn't call ahead. I went to his office, not his house, and I took him to lunch at a diner we used to go to when he was in college. He looked tired, not sleep-deprived, tired, something deeper than that. Like something in him had been running too long without rest. It took most of the meal. But eventually, slowly, with me asking the right questions and not reacting when the answer surprised me, it came out. Over the past 2 years, my son had transferred a total of $68,000 out of their joint account, not for shared expenses. For her mother's expenses, Diane's mortgage, after her divorce settlement, ran short. Diane's car, Diane's credit card debt, which turned out to be considerable. My son had brought it up once gently, he said, very gently, and Vanessa had cried for 2 hours and told him that family didn't keep score, and that if he really loved her, he would understand that her mother had sacrificed everything for her, and that she was starting to question whether they shared the same values. He had apologized. He had not brought it up again. He had also, at Vanessa's suggestion, removed his father-me from his emergency contact at work. She had said it made more sense for it to be her. He had agreed. He mentioned this like it was a small administrative detail. I held my coffee cup very tightly and said nothing. I asked him if he was happy. He looked out the window for a long time. He said, "I think I'm just tired." I said, "That's not the same thing." He didn't answer. I drove home that evening with the particular feeling of a man who has just understood something he can't unknow. I had been a structural engineer. I knew what it looked like when a foundation had been quietly, methodically compromised. The surface could look fine for a long time, and then one day, without warning, I started paying attention in a different way. I didn't confront Vanessa. I didn't tell my son what I was doing. I simply watched. I'm 63 years old. I have attended more project meetings than I can count, in rooms full of people who were not saying what they meant. I know how to watch. What I saw, once I stopped making excuses for it, was a system. Vanessa controlled the information my son received. If I called the house, she would answer and relay messages in ways that were slightly, almost imperceptibly altered. "Your dad called. He sounded worried about something, you know how he gets." She positioned my concern as anxiety, my interest as interference. She had done the same with his 2 closest friends from college. One of them, a man my son had known since he was 18, told me later that he had been made to feel, gradually, that he was a bad influence. That spending time with him took my son away from his real responsibilities. He had backed off. He hadn't wanted to cause problems. Her mother, Diane, was the architecture behind it. I understood this slowly. Vanessa was the presence in my son's daily life, but Diane was the one who had built the original design. Diane would call Vanessa while my son was in the room, and Vanessa would step out, and when she came back, her mood would have shifted in ways my son had learned to manage. Diane visited for a week every 2 months. After each visit, something changed, a new financial decision, a new reason my son needed to be less available to the outside world. Diane was charming and warm, and she had been doing this, I eventually realized, her entire life. She had done it to her own ex-husband until he had nothing left to give. Then she had taught her daughter how. I want to say here, I am not a man who makes reckless decisions. I spent 30 years in a field where a miscalculation could bring something down. I believe in being certain before you act. So for 3 months after that lunch at the diner, I watched and I documented and I said nothing. I built my case the same way I built every project methodically, without shortcuts. And then Vanessa's mother came to visit for Christmas. My son invited me to their house for Christmas dinner. It was the first time in 2 years I had been invited, and I recognized that for what it was, my son trying to hold 2 parts of his life together. I said yes. I brought the sweet potato casserole I have made every Christmas since my son was 4 years old, because his mother made it before me, and I was not going to let that tradition disappear. Diane arrived an hour before I did. I could feel it the moment I walked in, the way the rooms had already arranged themselves around her presence. My son met me at the door. He hugged me longer than usual. His wife appeared behind him, smiling, and said, "We're so glad you're here." Her mother appeared a moment later, and the smile she gave me was that same warm, focused smile. "We've heard so much about you," she said, as if we had not met a dozen times before, resetting the baseline, starting from zero, where she had the advantage. Dinner was fine for the first hour. I watched Diane steer conversations away from anything that might allow my son to speak at length. I watched Vanessa monitor my son's face the way you monitor a gauge. I ate my food and I asked neutral questions, and I let them believe I was simply an aging man enjoying a family holiday. Then my son mentioned, in passing, that he had been offered a promotion at work, senior project manager, a significant title, a significant raise. He said it casually, like he was mentioning the weather. I could tell from the way he said it that he had rehearsed the casualness. Vanessa stopped cutting her food. There was a pause, just 2 or 3 seconds, and then she said, "We talked about this." Her voice was pleasant, level, the hours, the travel. "We decided it wasn't the right time." My son nodded. He looked at his plate. I said, "I didn't know about that opportunity. That's a big deal. Congratulations." Vanessa looked at me. "It's something we're navigating as a family," she said. "We appreciate the support." We. And then Diane set down her fork and said, in that gentle, reasonable voice, "You know, at a certain point, fathers have to trust their sons to make their own decisions." She smiled at me, not unkindly, just conclusively, the way you close a door. Michael is very lucky to have a wife who thinks about the whole picture. The table went quiet. My son stared at his food. He didn't look up. He was 36 years old, a man who designed load-bearing structures for a living, and he was staring at his plate because his mother-in-law had just told his father to mind his business, and he could not find a way to object. That was the moment. Not an explosion, not a dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet, practiced erasure. And my son sitting there, having learned to accept it. I picked up my napkin. I folded it carefully. I set it on the table beside my plate, and I said, "Excuse me for just a moment." I walked to the front hallway. I took out my phone. I made one call. I want to explain who I called, because it matters. 2 years before that dinner, at a 4th of July party, I had been introduced to a woman named Patricia who worked as a certified forensic accountant specializing in financial abuse cases. We had spoken for maybe 40 minutes. I had found her work fascinating in the abstract, never imagining it would become relevant to my own life. I had kept her card because I keep everyone's card. I am organized. It is a thing my son used to tease me about. I had called Patricia 3 months earlier, after the lunch at the diner, and laid out everything I had documented. She had asked careful questions. She had asked me to collect specific records, and I had discreetly, over the following weeks, with my son's gradually earned cooperation once he understood what I was building. Patricia had spent those 3 months doing what she did. She was very good at what she did. What she had found went beyond the $68,000 my son knew about. Over a period of nearly 3 years, my daughter-in-law had moved money methodically, in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags from my son's personal accounts, his 401 key loan provisions, and 2 credit lines taken out in both their names that my son had signed without fully reading. The total was $112,000. Diane's mortgage, Diane's car, Diane's debt. a renovation on Diane's house, and Patricia had discovered a joint investment account in Diane and Vanessa's names that my son knew nothing about. Patricia had also found that Vanessa had done this before, a previous relationship 5 years earlier. A settlement had been reached out of court. When I came back to that Christmas dinner table, I sat down. I picked up my fork. I ate 2 more bites of my food. I thanked Vanessa for the meal. I hugged my son at the door, and I held on for a moment longer than usual. I told him I loved him. I drove home. 3 days after Christmas, my son was contacted by the attorney I had retained. He was also contacted by Patricia, who sat with him for 4 hours and walked him through every document, every transfer, every account. I was not in the room for that. I had offered to be. My son said he needed to do it alone, and I respected that completely. He called me that night. He didn't say much for the first few minutes. I could hear him breathing. Finally he said, "Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "How long did you know?" I said, "I started to suspect about a year ago. I only had proof in the last few months." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I kept thinking I was imagining it. I kept thinking I was being ungrateful." I said, "I know, son. That's what it's designed to make you think." What happened in the following weeks was not a spectacle. It was paperwork and attorneys and a process that was methodical and exhausting. My son separated his finances immediately, which was possible because Patricia had already mapped out exactly what needed to be done and in what order. The attorney filed a civil action for financial fraud. Vanessa's previous settlement was introduced as a documented pattern. Diane was named in the filing. Vanessa called me once, the week after my son served the papers. I let it go to voicemail. She said I had destroyed her marriage. She said I had interfered in something I didn't understand. She said she had always treated my son well, that everything she had done was for their future, that I was a bitter old man who had never accepted her. She said her mother was devastated. I listened to it once and then I deleted it. Diane did not call me. I hadn't expected her to. Women like Diane don't make that kind of mistake. My son moved out in January. He came to stay with me for 6 weeks, and those were, I want to say this honestly, 6 of the best weeks I have had in years. Not because of the circumstances were painful for both of us, but because my son was in my house again, eating dinner at my table, and he talked the way he used to talk, rambling, interrupting himself, 3 topics at once. The first time it happened, I had to leave the kitchen for a minute because I didn't want him to see my face. He is doing well now. He took the promotion. He has started fishing again. He called me last week from the water just to describe what the light looked like that morning, which is something he used to do when he was young, calling from wherever he was to describe something beautiful, as though it wasn't worth fully experiencing until he'd shared it with someone. I'm 63 years old. I have made mistakes in my life, plenty of them, and there are choices I would make differently if I had the chance. But I have never once regretted spending 30 years paying close attention to how things are built and what makes them fall. The foundation of my son's life had been quietly worked on for 3 years. What I did was go in with the right tools, at the right time, and shore it up before it came down entirely. That's all any father can do. I want to say something to anyone watching this who sees themselves in my son's situation, not in the drama of it, not in the specifics, but in that feeling of being in a room and not quite recognizing yourself anymore. The way you used to speak, the things you used to want, the people you used to call without thinking. If you are sitting somewhere right now, reading the small print of your own bank statements for the first time in years because something in you finally said, "Look," then I want you to hear this. What you find is not your fault. The confusion is not a character flaw. The fact that you trusted someone you loved is not a weakness. It is actually, in the architecture of who you are, a strength. It was simply used against you. You are allowed to look. You are allowed to ask for help. You are allowed to make one call. There is a lot of life on the other side of that call. I have watched my son find his way back to it. I am watching him right now, and I am so proud of the man he is not, despite what he went through, but because of how he is walking out of it. Carefully, honestly, on his own terms. His mother would have loved to see it. I think about that sometimes, what she would say if she could see him now. I think she would say what she always said to him when he was small and something hard had happened and he was trying to make sense of it. She would say, "See? Still standing." Yeah, still standing. If this story reached you where you needed it today, if it helped you feel a little less alone, or a little clearer on something you've been trying to name, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave it in the comments. It means more than you might think, knowing you're out there.